older East Asian MMORPG from back in the 2000s in all the wrong ways. Blade and Soul Neo has quite a few issues that will likely hamper it from truly breaking into the international MMO market, where genre behemoths like World of Warcraft have dominated for so long despite having barriers to entry in the form of an upfront buy-in as well as a monthly subscription cost. The fact that Blade and Soul Neo is a free-to-play game becomes incredibly evident not just with the fact that you don't have to pay any money to start playing, but also once you actually spend some time with the game and look at all the different ways it has been monetized. It feels like an MMORPG that was designed from the ground up to spend as much of your time as possible with incredibly repetitive action and menial tasks to try and get you to spend as much money as possible. Now, don't get me wrong, you don't actually have to spend any money if you're just looking for grinding in an online game. In fact, Blade and Soul Neo allows you to grind out just about everything you could possibly want just through pure gameplay. And while this might sound like a great idea in theory, in practice, you're bound to get lost in the myriad of different currencies, crafting materials, marketplaces, ways to partake in the player economy, and even cosmetic items. Things start out innocently enough with Blade and Soul Neo. There's an extended tutorial section that slowly introduces you to the core gameplay mechanics of your class, and gives you some simple gear to start out with before you get thrust into bigger fights. Very quickly after the tutorial, however, the pacing takes a massive jump off a cliff. After seeing the rather epic scene of your martial arts school getting invaded by demons, you're gonna then spend the next several hours dealing with local skirmishes between various factions of bandits.
Another dead fool.
The core gameplay is simple enough, and rather than using the tab targeting style of gameplay that was made popular by World of Warcraft and has since been adopted by just about every 3D MMO out there, Blade and Soul Neo instead has you ducking, weaving, dodging, and striking, much like you would in traditional third-person action games. You get a few skills depending on your class of choice, and from that point on, things don't really change much. Sure, you get access to more abilities as you level up, but the core gameplay of your class that gets introduced to you at level 1 never really felt any different when you reach, say, level 10. As a Blade Master, I was still occasionally blocking attacks to gather up energy points that I could then use up with a powerful thrust attack. Sure, the fact that enemy attacks were telegraphed well enough to make timely blocking simple and rewarding might be fun, but there is never really any variation introduced. The only real change that happens as you continue to gain levels and new equipment is that you might see a few damage numbers get larger. Speaking of your class, you get a few options in Blade and Soul Neo during character creation. After you pick out your race, you then get to pick your class. There are a total of 14 different classes, each featuring their own style of gameplay and a couple of unique mechanics. Some might be better off as frontline melee fighters, while others might be better off sneaking behind enemy lines to land some sneak attacks. Some players might even decide to stay in the back, buffing their allies with helpful spells. Ultimately, just about every class feels fundamentally the same. The only real differences tend to be the one core mechanics. The Blade Master, for instance, has to make heavy use of their ability to block. The Assassin, on the other hand, is constantly looking for ways to use stealth so that they can land powerful critical hits. The experience is further brought down by the simple fact that enemies aren't really designed with the idea of pushing your class to its absolute limits. Just about every enemy in the game tends to have one massively telegraphed attack that you can easily dodge or block and start pushing out those combos. In fact, the primary source of difficulty throughout the game's solo questing comes from multiple enemies being thrown at you simultaneously. And even this is only really difficult sometimes, since you can just as easily block or dodge the attacks of multiple enemies. When it comes to progression, you primarily unlock new abilities for your class by leveling up and using the skill points you earn. While quite simple for your base abilities, a bit of complexity is present in how you travel deeper down the skill tree. To do this, you have to find a specific book for your skill that you might want. This book can then be used up to slot the skill into one of your accessories. Equipping this accessory will then give you the ability to use the skill. These skills can then be made stronger by finding the same skill book once again to use on the same accessory. You can also unlock more effects for your skills by making use of Valor Stones, which allows you to buff up your skills of choice. However, the effects tend to be quite mundane, like just a flat damage increase or reduced resource usage. But they do tend to still make a big difference in combat. The skill points you use up can also be refunded to be spent on other skills, allowing for quite a bit of experimentation as you try and figure out what skills work best for your style of play. When it comes to actually getting to the late game, however, Blade and Soul Neo has some severe pacing problems. Most of the quests in the game are the bog standard cookie-cutter quests that you would expect from an MMORPG that isn't really trying to push its boundaries. You're going to be running around in large open fields, waiting for specific monsters to spawn, and killing them multiple times. There isn't really much in the way of variety here, and even the most story-centric quests still ultimately end up with you having to do the same type of quests repeatedly. Things do get somewhat better with a few quests that put you in dungeons. This is where Blade and Soul Neo starts feeling at least slightly challenging. The enemies in these dungeons seem like they're placed with actual encounter design in mind, and encourage the player to think strategically about how they're going to kill them. Rushing into a fight in one of these dungeons is definitely a death sentence, and you're going to often end up using some of your crowd controlling abilities to stun the strongest enemy in a group while you quickly take out the others. Generally speaking, PvE content in Blade and Soul Neo has the tendency to feel incredibly repetitive most of the time. There are a few highlights, like when you hit up a dungeon with a group and all of you band together to complete it. The vast majority of the time, however, the game is filled with incredibly boring and uninspired quests. The game thankfully features great matchmaking that lets you jump into dungeons with other players quite easily. The only thing you have to be careful about is making sure that your level and gear are up to snuff. The UI in Blade and Soul Neo feels quite cluttered. However, when it comes to functionality, it works just fine. It's easy to figure out which piece of equipment goes where, and some aspects, like the quest journal, can be quite helpful in letting you figure out where you're supposed to be going next. Blade and Soul Neo being a remaster of Unreal Engine 4 doesn't really help that much, since the visual upgrade isn't particularly notable. The environments look somewhat decent at times, but the NPC models also look like they're from a game from a couple of console generations ago. This doesn't feel like a deliberate artistic choice either, since the player character models all look relatively much more modern and of higher fidelity. NPCs feel like they've been taken right out of the PlayStation 2 game that also happens to have annoying aliasing. The best I can say about the new engine for Blade and Soul Neo is that it at least runs well enough. I was able to get stable frame rates despite maxing out every graphical setting on my mid-end PC. All in all, Blade and Soul Neo isn't a particularly good MMORPG. Even when it comes to playing a free one, there are still better choices out there. The level of monetization is egregious. It not only includes microtransactions, but a battle pass as well. The story is incredibly dull, and the only way to ignore it is to have something interesting happening on a second monitor nearby. If you're looking for a compelling story, deep gameplay, or epic boss fights, you would be better off looking elsewhere. Hey, did you know that we at Gaming Vault upload new videos every day? Stick around, drop a like, subscribe, and hit that bell. And let us know what kind of content you'd like to see. Comment below.
a rough town to run. I can make it easier for you. This way, something to nibble on. Even when you have no bait, you can still cast a line and hope. Revolting!
Team Grunt won the round. Team Wolf has been eliminated. Hurry now, swift as a fox, fierce as a wolf. Clash!
If you want to clean up the city, don't you need to understand where that dirt comes from?
Defeat! The round is over.
Was that me?
Tremble before the behemoth, Scion! His thirst for bloodshed stands the test of time. That's sure to catch the crowd's eye. For the thrill of combat, we spare no expense. Battle! Torch the battleground! Skillful triumph!
Burn it.
Attack!
I refuse to succumb to culinary degradation. My diet is nothing salt. World is my beast.
Round over! You lost! Team Scuttle has been eliminated!
Let us eat voraciously and overindulge. Another snack.
In early 2020, I started becoming increasingly interested in finance. I know, cool. But this was mostly trying to make sense of the logic behind what the Federal Reserve did in response to COVID, which I'll get into later. But the more and more I learned, the less and less it made sense. So I started deeply analyzing stocks from companies that I was personally and professionally familiar with, such as Curiosity and Spotify, led me to starting a private fund that strategically shorted those companies. I even ended up getting hired as a freelance consultant for venture capital firms. Me, a musician with no higher education whatsoever. And the more time that I spent looking at and studying the big picture, the more that I doubted myself, as if the only two options were option A, me being unable to understand what every 25-year-old day trader understands, or option B, I'm right and every hedge fund manager and billionaire is wrong. But what if there's a third option? What if capitalism's death wasn't a mistake or something that the ultra-wealthy were trying to avoid? What if the pesky burden of labor laws and taxation could be avoided by deprioritizing the goal of financial profit, or maybe even money itself? This video is going to explain or explore what I and an increasing number of economists think is happening or has already happened to capitalism. More importantly, I'm going to try to encapsulate the unsettling socioeconomic reality that we're living in, as so much has happened in the last decade that it seems foggy to us. You can't fairly describe capitalism without mentioning its predecessor, feudalism. And feudalism was a power structure in kingdoms where wealth was defined by the control of land rather than money. And our history books tell us that feudalism ended sometime in the late 15th century, but there's a much more recent version of it that would be a much better example for the purpose of this video. When the Civil War ended, or when the first American Civil War ended, depending on how far into the future you're watching this video, a lot of former slaves were offered a deal where they could continue living and farming on the same land where they were slaves in exchange for a portion of the crops. In many cases, they would only be able to sell their remaining crops through the plantation store, and with that income they could participate in trade, which would allow them to buy more tools and negotiating power in hopes to eventually buy land for themselves. By the late 1930s, 2/3 of sharecroppers were actually white, and the Great Depression had shut down enough farms that many of the tenants migrated to large cities to become factory workers. It would be important to note that sharecropping is not technically outlawed today, it's just that American capitalism's growth made it obsolete. The former definition of capitalism is a system in which individuals and private parties control the means of production, and profits are the key driver of economic activity. And it's important to note that within the closed system, no new variable, capitalism's success can almost exclusively be measured by the velocity of money. The classic example is the farmer and the tenant. The tiny economy is $50 total. The farmer trades $50 for the mechanic for tractor repair, and the mechanic trades $40 for corn from the farmer, and then buys a barn calf for $10 from the farmer. And in this cycle, $100 is changed hands, so the velocity of money is measured as 2. This is calculated as the velocity within a time period equals the total sum of transactions over the total of money in that economy. In a larger modern economy, the classic way to increase the velocity of money is to reduce interest rates, but when spending becomes reckless and leads to higher prices and reduced currency value, the classic move is to make borrowing more expensive. Governments around the world either control or have a lot of influence in interest rates, and some people think that because of this, the Federal Reserve should be abolished. And nobody could predict exactly what would happen if the Federal Reserve was abolished, but it would almost certainly result in a lot of turbulence in the market that would leave a lot of victims in its wake around the world.
A really useful way to understand how wealth is distributed is to stop using money as a commodity and use something that people actually use or consume. Let's say a can of Coke Zero buying a 12-pack. A person with $100,000 US in a traditional investment fund like Vanguard would come out to about 312,000 cans of Coke Zero in 2019. That same investment, untouched, is worth about 330,000 cans of Coke Zero now. 18,000 cans of Coke Zero free. Now, on the other hand, a person working for minimum wage full-time in Iowa would have made 43,360 cans per year before taxes in 2019. Today, in 2025, they're making 22,177 cans. Somehow, this person got a 49% wage cut, while the person with the market fund got free soda. Amazingly, through the miracle of inflation, the money decreases in value for everyone, while the actual wealth itself moves up to the top.
The concept of the stock market was proposed in 1792, but it wasn't until 1830 when the first stock was sold on the New York Stock Exchange. It was initially filled with railroads and banks, but by the next decade, everybody with a business idea wanted to have their name listed. This rapidly stimulated both technological and economic growth, and by the end of the century, the middle class was getting more and more familiar with investing. By the 1920s, you might be seen as a fool for not being involved in stock trading. In fact, you might be seen as a fool for not borrowing money to buy stocks. Many middle-class investors were borrowing with a 1-to-3 ratio, meaning that they would borrow $300 for every $100 they invested. This sounds absolutely insane, but it didn't seem as risky due to the introduction of futures. In the mid-1800s, the Chicago Board of Trade had a pretty great idea to make grain trade a lot more reliable and a lot less volatile. Rather than grain farms having to guess what demand would be at the end of the season, they could sell it at a discount in advance.
A future is not a stock or share, but a contract